This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Welcome to Body Count, a history podcast.
All right, we do have a guest today, but I'm still going to read our body count intro because you guys expect it. So hello and welcome to Body Count, the podcast where we believe history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes, and a proud member of the Big Heads Podcast Network. We're here to show you don't hate history, you just hate the way it was taught to you. Only rule, when we choose a topic, someone, or as is usually the case, a lot of someone's, died as a direct result of the things that we are discussing. We give you the series of events in a narrative fashion, and by the end, hope to correlate said current events and said historical events, all together in a mash that everybody understands. Now, I'm not PBS Kim Burns or Dan Carlin. If you want a Hoover-esque Just the Facts Man history podcast, we're not going to be for you. I.e., there will be analysis, opinions, and this is not a lecture. My opinions are my own. Know that I hold all my co-hosts, guests, whatever, verbally hostage. Direct your hate at me, folks, in my DMs where it belongs. It said tragedy plus time equals comedy. No, we giggle at occasionally rough subject matter. We're not actively trying to offend anyone. You have officially been warned. Now, if you're okay with all of that horseshit, I'm your host, Jessica Manor, and I'm joined today by my co-host,
Bethany Skeleton. I don't know why I said it that way.
We also have a guesty guest.
Hi, guys. Hey, guesty guest.
Here for part 3 of his interview series.
Who are you,
Warren.
sir?
I am Dr.
are
Warren
you?
Doctor.
Doctor.
You can just call me Dr. Doc. Because it's
Doctor.
That's it. That's all you're going to bring us is your
Oh,
illustrious Dr. title.
I thought you just needed my name.
yeah, he's that big of a deal. Remember?
I'm just for our
Prime
viewers
ministers
to
were
know,
texting him early this morning. Okay.
I'm a couple vodka shots in, and I don't really give a shit what you two twats have to say this early in the morning.
Thank you. Shit.
Sorry, I'm vodka fueled. I really do apologize. I'll tone it down by like 10%. So, as you all know, Warren has done not one,
But two
series with us so far, rapping about Winston Churchill and the Islamic world, specifically because he...
Churchill. Sorry. You said rapping, and I immediately went to all right. I'm so dumb.
Oh, I'm glad I drank enough to lower myself to where I need to be to host this podcast.
Wow, thanks, Jessica. Rude.
Well, not by that standard. I met my own self.
I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad you are.
Are you?
I think he just says that so that he doesn't offend us.
That's not true.
So too.
He's like, it's true.
This is the most fun I've ever had.
Good. That makes us excited. But go ahead. And what the central theme of all these interviews has been to be essentially to talk about Warren's excellent book. And I really, really cannot plug it enough. As you know, anybody that we have, we don't really like plugging their shit on our shit because, hey, it's about us. But we are excited.
Hold on. It's more about you, Jessica, than not us.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody has any question about what a narcissist I am.
I can say it because I'm your friend-ish.
You can also say it because it's true, and we don't shy away from the truth in these days and times. So, Warren, what is the title of your book, and where do we find it?
The full title, not just the beginning. I want the whole thing. Come on, give it to me.
Wow. That's a large demand.
Hey.
Churchill and the Islamic world, the Middle East, empire, and Orientalism, or something like that.
No.
I just spit my drink all over the counter because I thought I was very disrespectful in our second interview by going Churchill and Islam, a lot of other shit. But the fact that you can't bring it up, can't bring it up immediately. Oh, shit. It's right here on my Google. Let's go.
Churchill and the Islamic world, Orientalism, empire, and diplomacy in the Middle East.
Boom! There it is. But, guys, it is available on Amazon in hardcover, which, if you are a book collector, a bibliophile like myself, I suggest you get it in hardcover, personally. But I'm a perfectionist. So you can also get the title in paperback, but more importantly, for all you Kindlephiles out there, that's what I call you, non-book holders. You can get it in Kindle. So I suggest you go out, you read it, especially all you World War buffs. And I know there are a lot of people that really, really get into Winston Churchill, and I am one of those. So I'm so excited that Warren has agreed to put up with our bullshit, not once, not twice, but now it's the third time.
Hey, at least we keep him coming back for more.
Always.
Well, let's be honest, Warren does.
I'm your biggest fan.
Oh, I think I just blushed.
I
wish you could see I just blushed.
Else, but blush was super sweet, so we're gonna leave it at that.
We're gonna go with that one. And welcome to the 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock a.m. podcast.
It's so early. And I know that our fans generally expect us to be a lot more intoxicated than what we currently are. But don't worry.
We'll be there by the end.
Warren's going to be exasperated. And so that'll be fun for us. So last time we left off, I believe we had kind of summed up Churchill's wilderness years. Sure. And now we are ready.
But I'm here for it.
We're now entering the World War II phase of the podcast. We may be sometime. So the first thing going into the Second World War that's interesting about Churchill and Islam is that for let's see, as soon as the sort of Blitz starts, so there's a cabinet meeting in October 1940, and in this cabinet meeting, the sort of war cabinet sets aside a large sum of money to help build the Central Mosque in London, which is perhaps odd that you would imagine Churchill doing that. Churchill sees this as a way to help bring along the sort of Middle East and the elements of the British Empire in the Middle East that are allied to the British Empire, as a way to say, look, we respect your religion. We recognize that Islam is a part of the British Empire. And so they set aside a sort of vast sum of money to build the London Central Mosque. And this is interesting for a couple reasons. One is later Churchill gives a speech and he talks about how all the world of the world of Islam is with Britain and the sort of allied cause, right? And he also exclusively talks about Turkey when he does that. Now, the reason that all this kind of links together is because for Churchill, his thinking about what the Islamic world is still very sort of like 19th century focused. So he still thinks that for some reason, if he can control or if he can create a good, strong feeling between what had been the caliphate, which is now, a purely secular Turkey, that the rest of the Islamic world, all the Arabs and so forth, would naturally come along because that's what Istanbul or what had been Constantinople was doing. And of course, he couldn't be further from the truth, which I think is quite an interesting thing. So he's still sort of seeing this through 19th century kind of Victorian lenses, if that makes sense.
So he's like,
would you argue
at
that maybe that was the time that he still existed, the time that he had spent in the empire, that was maybe a more pertinent belief than what it would be at the current time? Does that make sense?
It does. So yeah, I absolutely think that his formative years.
Sorry, I'm confused. I'm not gonna lie. What do you mean by that? Like he's still kind of looking from his past and using his past. Okay. Oh hey. Oh my God. I knew.
I think that's absolutely right. I think his formative years in the empire is still how he kind of sees the world working, even though the world had moved on. Right after the First World War, everything's totally different. And he's still sort of thinking like it's 1906.
But he hasn't been out in it. He hasn't been in the field. He hadn't been abroad. I mean, not in the same way that he was mixing with general populations of different faiths, different countries. He wasn't the young man anymore. This is not Churchill, the young man.
Because he had been beforehand, but then he stopped. So he's kind of stuck in that little rut, like that little time where he's like, I'm still here even though everybody else has moved on.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he did travel a lot in Europe, but he didn't really travel so much in the Middle East. He would occasionally go to Algeria in the 30s. Excuse me, not Algeria. Morocco in the 30s with Lloyd George on vacation sometimes, but for the most part he didn't go to any imperial holdings sort of in the interwar period. So he's really sort of fallen out of touch. So he's still thinking in sort of 19th century ways of thinking about the Middle East. And this creates some real interesting things that come on throughout the war that I think that are sort of worth mentioning. And one of the things is that later on during the war, once the sort, because as things approach, right, there's a thing in Iraq called the al-Rashidi coup, where some pro-fascist, pro-German elements in Iraq were trying to overthrow the sort of British, imperial stations there, and quickly that got slapped down. And then de Gaulle and Churchill tried to figure out what to do with Syria to get rid of Syria, and that creates all sorts of problems between France and Britain because Churchill didn't want to liberate Syria to replace the Vichy French with the Free French, if you see what I'm saying. So there's this whole issue about what you do with Syria.
And one could argue there's a whole issue about what to do with Syria still.
Yeah. So that hasn't really moved on much in many ways. Syria is still sort of a problem.
Just a little bit.
So quite quickly it becomes, once they slap down the al-Rashidi coup in, I think that's 41, it becomes, what can we do with the Middle East to ensure that the Middle East that we can keep those oil fields safe in Persia and in Iraq and make sure that things continue on. So and
still gain from it and still get something out of it.
Exactly. That they can continue to get the fuel that they need, for instance, over in Egypt, where of course they'll be fighting with Rommel in North Africa. And so there's a plan that Churchill's develops, and this is sort of by the middle of the war, and it's called the Philby Plan, and it's based on a guy's work, a guy named Harry St. John Philby, who was the father of Kim Philby, the famous spy of the Cambridge Five. And Philby went to Saudi Arabia and was talking with bin Saud. Now, in the interim, I don't know how much we talked about this last time, but of course, bin Saud had removed the Sheriff of Mecca and formed sort of Saudi Arabia by uniting the various bits of Arabia. And of course, had by the sort of Second World War had a firm grip on Saudi Arabia. And he's a really remarkable character. And Churchill absolutely was kind of in awe of him because he's kind of a warrior prince. And of course, he was also a Wahhabist, which is quite, a sort of very strict version of Islam. which becomes problematic. We'll talk about that in a bit. But
yeah.
there is a real funny moment, but I can come to that in a second. So Philby comes up with this idea that Churchill endorses, and it's the idea that he's going to build another sort of coalition in the Middle East like he had in the First World War. And in this one, Ben Saud would sit at the top as what Churchill called the boss of bosses. And then places like Jordan and Palestine would all kind of be in orbit of Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, they would all sort of be in orbit of Saudi Arabia. But in this vision, of course, Israel, or at least the Jewish national homeland, the Jews, would also have to be a part of this unit. And Ben Saud absolutely refused point blank. He said, look, I'm not going to do this if the Jews are a part of this. So ultimately the plan collapses. But this is all to do with again, Churchill trying to impose the same sort of solution that he had done in the sort of 1920s in the Second World War. Because you can see again he's sort of stuck in the past in the way of his thinking. So instead of the sheriff of Mecca, he would just have Ben Saud at the top, and he think that the structure would work. Of course, it didn't, as it turns out.
Well, did he impose this because it worked the first time? I can't remember, because I remember we talking about this, but did it actually, his plan work? Is that why he's continuing to act his plan out?
The plan sort of worked and it sort of didn't. So it worked in terms of keeping, Faisal in Iraq and Abdullah in Jordan, although eventually Faisal was killed. But what the problem was is that the sheriff of Mecca, Britain, sort of 2 years after the deal was signed, or by 1924, so 3 years, he basically stopped paying subsidies to Ben Saud. And so Ben Saud thought, well, I'm going to unite Saudi Arabia. So he invaded Mecca and threw the sheriff of Mecca out and consolidated power in Saudi Arabia, which sort of undermined the initial sort of structures that were originally put in place.
Okay.
So Ben Saud's one of those guys who's not your friend, and then until he's your friend, and then he's not again, if you know what I mean.
Boy,
you mean a
that sounds
politician?
familiar.
Oh.
Yeah, you get that in the Middle East. And there's some really other interesting things that are going on. So like Abdullah in Jordan it becomes a sort of like leading a kind of propaganda radio show to help try to convince Arabs that they should be on the Allied side. And he's doing this to counter. There's a guy named Muhammad Adnan al-Husseini.
Yes! Al-Husseini is on the scene. Oh, sorry. I mean, I'm not going to celebrate that necessarily, but okay.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Sorry, I got real excited.
Al-Husseini, right, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem. He is like a hardcore pro-Nazi, anti-British leader of the Arabs. He led the Arab uprising. And so he's putting out his own radio program.
Really quickly, and this is going to massively sidetrack from Churchill, and I do apologize. What I have never understood and will never understand is why, and I want you to explain to me, why do we have this massive pro-fascist, pro-Hitler movement out of some Middle Eastern leaders? Because they have to realize, I mean, what year are we talking here?
So this is sort of during the war. These are during the war years.
Okay, so I want to know specifically why, and I'm sorry, I'm sidetracking the hell out of you, and I don't mean to, why we get this pro-fascist lean from so many Islamic rulers. I have never understood that. Because
because I write sort of not at length, but I do try to tackle this subject in the book.
Okay.
Because it is a relation.
And that's where I'm a little bit confused, if that makes sense.
And so for leaders like al-Husseini and other members of, well, usually it's Palestine and other Arabs else, that they see what Britain's done in the Middle East and they think, God, these are imperial powers. They're awful. They're our enemy. Fascism happens to be the best thing to fight these imperial powers, they think. So they sort of embrace this notion of fascism.
Which I don't disagree with. but I have to see where they don't understand where the ideology of the clash of fascism is not going to clash very much with their general religious ideology.
So
And
I mean,
was the plan to now we're rid of these imperialists and we think that we're going to stamp out these psychos? Like,
no, I mean, this is one of the weird things. So, like Al Husseini, there are lots of pictures of Al Husseini meeting with Hitler, trying to come up with plans for the Jews together. I mean, it's real dark stuff these guys are into. Obviously, for Al Husseini and the Palestinians that follow him and other Arabs that follow him, it's about what you do with the Jews, and that's also true for the Nazis.
It is purely a Jewish almost aligning of. I mean, because here's my thing though: at some point, they have to know if the fascists are going to turn on Stalin and our communist comrades. How long do you think you're going to last?
Well, I think that's a valid point. I mean, especially as for the Nazis, right? It's a genetic thing about Semitic ethnicity.
Peoples.
Both
and so
they are Semitic.
Exactly. That was it's something. And when I was reading, and I could kind of wrap my head around it. It's been a gap in all of my education that I've never quite understood. And I have to believe at some point they think maybe that they're going to be able to lead the same sort of war, maybe against other powers that, hey, enemy and my enemy is my friend for now, but I'm going to be able to overthrow this. I think it's so interesting that they vastly underestimated Nazi power. I really, I don't know. It always fascinates me. And that's a whole other podcast in and of itself. And I know I'm sidetracking completely everybody, and I apologize. But it's just something that we're talking about it. And I feel like our viewers are kind of going to want to know that.
There is a guy who specializes in studying this, who I was with at Cambridge, named Dave Mottadell, who's written a good book about the Arabs, the sort of group of Arabs that followed with the Nazis. And I think you see two things happening here. One is that the Arabs, again, this is about anti-imperialism, whatever it takes to get rid of Britain, okay, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they completely misunderstand the nature of totalitarianism. They think it's conventional rules and that Hitler's wanting to go east and he'll do whatever he wants in the east and he'll leave the Middle East alone, ultimately. Not fully understanding that a totalitarian fish is like a shark and it has to eat all the time or it doesn't work.
But would we say that's because, I mean, almost because these governments still are dealing in terms of small kingdoms and kingship, and that they had not evolved to the idea of like global totalitarianism yet, maybe.
Well, I think, I mean, so I think there is definitely an element around modernity there. So you've got, I mean, El Husseini's not, he's just a spokesman really for the disillusioned Palestinians, right? Mm-hmm. But you have all these fiefdoms, right, that exist, or sultanates that exist in the Middle East. And none of them, they're still operating essentially as despotic kings or authoritarian kings. They don't.
And I also want to highlight that too, is that maybe people are thinking Middle East today, where we have these countries and these kingships that follow, but that did not necessarily exist yet in the way that we recognize it today.
No, certainly not the political shape. Okay. I mean, as we know and see it now, some of the sultanates have remained the same. For instance, Kuwait is the same that it was when Britain sort of set it up. But there's obviously been
it's a small kingdom. Like I mean,
yeah, since it's like city states almost.
It's okay. Sorry, we'll get back to it. I got sidetracked. I got too interested. I apologize to our listeners.
I just drank a whole beer because I have no idea what the fuck just happened.
And the other thing I would
Just
say is
being honest. So.
these seeds that people like Husseini go on, Al Husseini, plants the seeds for ultimately what would turn into and evolve into the Ba'athist Party, both in Syria and
Right.
Iraq later on. So if you look
Right.
at Baathism, it's sort of a kind of strange mixture of fascism and kind of Islamic political.
Right, which is why I wanted to address it a little bit because I think it's kind of pertinent to. Okay, let's go on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have
Whole
no
nother
idea what just
podcast.
fucking
I
happened.
apologize. This is a whole nother.
You cocksuckers. Thanks for leaving me out in the goddamn dust. I have no clue what the fuck just happened. I drank an
sorry.
entire beer because I was like, I don't even want to interrupt because obviously this is important, but I don't even fucking know what's happening. I'm just going to sit here and drink my godforsaken great beer. Thank
point
you,
is,
beer.
I sidetracked Warren on a whole nother podcast that I want him to be on. So
Well, we can definitely. You're never going to get rid of me now. I'm
No,
like
I'm
the
not.
Ivy holding the building up.
I don't plan on it. So here we are.
So and the other thing I'd say just about the Middle East that I think is important to say about Churchill here is that eventually what happens in Iran, like with Persia, right,
Right.
is that it's occupied by the Soviets and it's also partly occupied by Britain, and you kind of have a proto Cold War thing going on there. On that end of the Middle East. And then on the Turkish end, this is a really remarkable part of the story. So for reasons I outlined earlier, Churchill thinks if he can get Turkey, he can get the rest of the Middle East. Well, Turkey is essentially completely neutral. And Churchill keeps trying to convince, I've just written an article on this. Churchill keeps trying to get him to come in the war on the Allied side. It's taken him years, and he almost personally takes over foreign policy as it relates to Turkey to try to get them in.
Excuse me,
yeah.
Professor. I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Why? Oh, why did he feel Turkey was so important though? Why did he spend all this time on trying to get them on his side?
The Ottomans.
This is a dumb question.
It's because it was the former seat of the Ottoman Empire, which meant it was also the former seat of the Caliphate. So because he's thinking like it's the 19th century.
He's operating older.
I didn't ask you, Jessica. I asked the professor.
All right.
But Jessica's right. It's essentially that he's still thinking like it's the 19th century, and that if he can get Turkey to go with him, the rest of the Middle East will follow because they were all part of the Ottoman Empire.
Because they look up to that kind of power. They're like, if they're doing it, we should do it too. Kind of.
He still thinks the caliphate is centralized.
Yeah. And I mean, even though he knows it's not, he still thinks that the legacy of it is enough to get people to kind of go along with it.
Okay. All right. Okay. I was just curious. I was like, why are you going to spend all this time on this particular spot? But no, okay. I get it. No,
and that's why.
Okay.
And eventually, like, I don't know, 50 days before the war ends, Turkey does come in on the side of the Allied powers. I don't know the exact number of days, but yeah, they came in at the last.
I guess we'll join.
Yeah, it looks like you guys are going to win.
It was a smart move.
But there's all sorts of negotiations around, Chrome and various things that Churchill gets personally into. But, he's trying to wage a war. He's doing loads and loads of things, but he sort of has this kind of obsession with Turkey he keeps coming back to. That really goes back to the First World War, that Ottoman Empire stuff. Exactly.
Yes. You got it, Bethany.
Yay! Hey. Woo.
So I think that that sort of sums up what's going on in the Middle East sort of broadly. And what I'd like to spend the rest of the time on this podcast maybe talking about, because I think this is really interesting, is in India. If we switch gears and we go to India.
I agree. We gotta go.
So the thing the major Churchillian topic with India that is on everybody's mouths in Britain is, of course, the 1943 Bengal famine, which a lot of people argue Churchill deliberately allowed to happen In some cases, they argue that this happened in the same way that Stalin starved out the Ukraine, which I think is nonsense. But people
I
make
agree.
I don't know what y'all are talking about, but sure. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe back up a little bit for Bethany, because I don't know that
I don't.
that she or that most people understand that India contains a significant population of Muslims.
Right. So we talked about that
Oh.
in one of the earlier podcasts, how the British Empire in
Right.
global power terms is an Islamic power because there are at least 90 million Muslims in India alone. And this is before
Sure. I remember that. Mhm,
Okay.
mhm, I remember that.
That's good.
Mhm.
That's good. So, well, after the fall of
so
Singapore,
annoyed right now. I'm sorry. Okay, go on.
after,
I'm sorry because I'm not on your historical geniusness between the two of you. I'm sorry. I'm slow to grasp. Okay.
you're doing a great job, Bethany.
Thank you.
You are.
for-
You're doing a great job, and everybody's going to understand it at the same level you understand it. And so here we go.
Okay. Thanks for making me feel slightly better, Jessica.
You're in a safe space, Bethany.
Okay.
You are
Thank
in a
you,
safe
Lauren.
space.
Okay.
So after the fall of Singapore, it became
Right.
very obvious that like Britain was going to have a much more difficult time holding its colonial possessions in the Pacific and Indian Ocean than originally they had thought, and that the Japanese Empire was a legitimate threat. So much so, there's lots of internal strife going on in India. You have Gandhi, who is of course a pacifist who wants to sit the war out. And you see a lot of the sort of Hindu Congress in India saying, look, we can't do this. Some of them even split off with a man named Suppa Bose who supports the Japanese and is doing sort of attacks against the British in India.
Okay.
And this is all wrapped up in Indian independence because, of course, the bill in 1935 was going to grant Indian independence, but then the war starts up. And so the idea is, well, after the war, India can have its independence. But Gandhi and others used the war in Jinnah and other people used the war as a moment to sort of renegotiate terms with Britain in order to gain independence. So you have things like the Cripps mission when they're going out and they're trying to solve how this is going to look and what independence is going to be. And Churchill doesn't, of course, because he's an imperialist in the 19th century, doesn't want to give too much away. So amidst all this context of toing and froing about the British Empire in India, there is a famine in Bengal, and millions of people are dying. I don't know the exact figures, and there's an argument that's been put out there by an Indian journalist named, I think, Majorki. It wrote a book called, I think, Churchill's Secret War, and it's about what went on in Bengal. And in this book, the argument is that Churchill sort of deliberately starves out Bengal, right? Because he doesn't like Hindus, and he doesn't.
I don't give any credence to that, though, necessarily. Like,
well, no, I don't either, and I don't think the documents bear that out. But this is something that exists in the sort of social.
Well, they don't. They really don't. And I'm sorry. I'm gonna. Oh God, I hate.
So wait, are you
interrupting
saying
you.
no? Are you interrupting because you're saying it didn't happen?
No, I don't believe that the sources bear out that this occurred. I don't support him. It's a very contentious point within a community. I just don't believe that any evidence bears it out. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree and are going to be very, very unhappy that I say this on this podcast. And that's what we try to avoid at all costs. But
I'm so glad they DM you and not me, because I'll be like, what?
Oh, fuck, do they DM me? Boy, and do they hit me up on email, and I'm going to get a lot of hate from this. But I don't believe that the sources bear that out. And
why? Why don't you believe it? I'm just curious. I really am. I'm sorry. I don't sigh, because I am genuinely curious as to why
We are not going to get through the Second World War.
I'm sorry.
No, we're really not. I am genuinely going to have to go in a second so I can make it to that thing.
I know. So maybe pop off about this, Warren, and let's talk about this for a second.
Yeah, because I would like to
everybody's
at
benefit.
least this bit here. You guys are not going to get rid of me.
No, we're not, and we don't.
Trying to leave us. Okay.
So you can't leave us. I'm sorry, you're not allowed to do that.
Because I genuinely am wondering. Like, it's not a dumb. I'm not trying to be stupid. I am truly asking.
Let Warren pick up where he left off, and maybe that's going to clear it up for you. And that I don't. I think it's a preposterous idea that Churchill allowed this to happen. It's absolutely, it had no benefit to him.
Okay.
Yes, no, I mean, I agree. The argument goes, right, that Churchill hates Indians. And I mean, there is a lot of documentary evidence to show that he did not like Hindus. There's a lot of like quasi-racist remarks and full-on racist remarks where Churchill has said disparaging things about sort of Hindus and about Gandhi in particular, right? And so you can see that this is one of the things that people have kind of seized on to say, oh, well, Churchill knew that this famine was happening and kind of allowed it to continue and to happen.
But also really quickly, I want to supply that. Let's all remember he was an imperialist. And I mean, he used to make jokes about Dickie Mountbatten and say this is the man that gave away India. To the point that I encourage you to remember, Bethany, that he is not an imperialist, but more of a man that is very much pro-empire and pro-British Empire and monarchist and not conservative in the way that we would define conservatism, but in the way that they would have devised conservative values at the time.
Okay.
That is correct. And so what?
So different interpretation. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
There are. So we.
Okay.
I mean, there was. I mean, and we know that there was a legitimate famine, right? And there's been some real interesting. The reason that this has come up again is that some scientific papers were released, or a study was done on the sort of poor soil quality and that kind of stuff that was happening. Then the question becomes, if there is, so that we know there's a famine, but is the famine deliberate or not? Well, if you go through the Churchill documents, it's very clear that he is doing what he can, bearing in mind he's fighting a war in Europe and in the Pacific, but they do have a lot of meetings and there are a lot of papers where they recognize that there's a rice shortage and a food shortage, and they do everything that they can in their power to send food. They try to send food from Australia. They write to the United States and ask for food. And of course they say, well, it's difficult for us to cross the Pacific because of the Japanese warboats. And so it becomes very, very difficult to get food to the people of Bengal. And it also sort of bears out, I think, in the documents that what you have incompetence on the ground about how what food is getting there is distributed. And there's a sort of problematic supply chain all the way up the top. But what I can definitely tell you is that there's no thing at the top trying to deliberately starve out Indians. And that's preposterous, like Jessica said. Because, at the end of the day, Churchill, and regardless how he feels privately about Hindus in India or whatever, he still recognizes as a sort of 19th century man of empire would, that you got to take care of the empire you got. And so it doesn't gel in any way in my mind that he would have engineered some sort of famine, particularly not in any kind of Stalin-esque way like he did in the Ukraine, as Ann Applebaum's research has showed.
Well, that's a different animal.
Absolutely. Stalin set about to deliberately kill people in the Ukraine, right? And to not let them out and to starve them out and let them die in every. To be fair,
Russia had been doing that since Alexei Mikhailovich. So, what are you going to do?
Exactly. I mean, and so you got, you know all that. Whereas I think what you have is a blend of unfortunate circumstances being in the war, a situation where there's probably a lot of administrative incompetence of people trying to distribute food, but it not sort of working, and that there just not being enough food to get there. And then the kind of logistical issues in getting the food there in the first place. But there's not a sort of, I think it happened by incompetence and ignorance rather than happening
Exactly.
deliberately.
And I'm sorry, I want to explain to Bethany a little bit further. Like, Bethany, they're not sparing their best officers. They are fighting a world war against, what year are we at now?
That's
Sorry,
43.
lost.
The Bengal famine is 43.
So we are looking at the end of a war to, as people put it, end all wars, right? So
Which is the second, right?
maybe
We
your
had this-
best
yeah.
and most competent are in charge of supply chain within, the empire. Does that make sense? Like, you're not using your research, and you simply can't, because you've got a world war on.
But
The
yet you
United
need the
States-
supplies.
The United
Right?
States has
Or no?
barely even dipped its toe into the war until,
The end, right? We didn't.
well,
we didn't
we're
actually get
there. We're
but
in
not
it,
like heavily.
but-
We're not heavily into it, right?
No, but
Or no?
we're heavily into defeating powers on the continent. We're talking about in Africa. We're looking at Central Europe. It's not that it's malicious. It's that maybe the best and brightest weren't there. It's a supply chain issue. So much as it's not a
Oh.
malicious attack against these
Because I was
people.
just gonna ask, like, what's in it for us? Like, what
Um,
what is in it for us? But now, no, that makes sense.
victory against the Axis powers. Like,
Okay.
it's what I guess I'm wanting her to try to understand, and that what I think her question is more necessarily is that it's not that India matters less to anybody, or that
Right.
it's we are in the throes of do or die right now in other parts of the continent. Does that make sense?
It does, but it's still maybe because I'm just not in that mindset, and maybe I don't fully quite. Like, I know I don't fully understand.
Okay, so if
It-
it's 43, the war ends in 45, or at least victory in Europe. You get what I'm saying? Like,
We're close to the end, but we're just now starting to really pick it up and get
yeah,
into
but this
it.
is like buckle the hell up, right? Like, it is.
Yeah,
It is
and
do or die time.
And remember, the Japanese in 43 still have, they still control most of the Pacific. They're still winning the Pacific theater at this point.
Okay.
So they're Americans, British. We're fighting bloody wars per island. Do you remember the Pearl Harbor episode? We're
Yeah,
fighting bloody island to bloody fucking island at this point. Like, just one at a time, do or die. Like, whatever you gotta do.
Literally a one-on-one situation, like throwing punches kind of thing. Yes or no? Maybe I missed it. Sorry. I'm trying to follow. I'm
Sorta.
sorry. I
I'm
am.
sorry,
I really
and
try.
I apologize to Warren, but I see where Bethany's getting lost in that you can't just it's not like a drop where we've got cargo planes as allies to spare to just drop in food for everybody at this point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like you don't even have control of the skies yet. The Japanese, so the Japanese are still, like I say, it's still quite dire in the Pacific, and you have this internal unrest in India where Suppa Bose and other sort of extremists are allying with the Japanese. Burma's been annexed by Japan, and Burma produced the majority of rice for Bengal and other places, so it's gone. And you have a situation where getting food to these people is just very, very difficult because you're fighting, a front in Europe and it just became, like you said, it's a supply chain issue and a logistics issue. And but there's not, a sort of
Way
racist
in.
impulse at the top to just say, well, screw them. You know, they
Oh.
are trying to get food to them.
Like,
They're
I
trying to get
think-
a way in, but there's struggling. So but they
think
can't. They seem to be like, fuck
Bethany
it. You know?
I think Bethany is thinking, why is there not maybe a Berlin airdrop situation? And it is simply not
Only because
possible.
I've seen it. Only because I've seen it. I've seen it happen. So that's why I'm in my mind. I'm like,
Right,
wait, why haven't we done this? But no, okay,
the
sorry.
Berlin
Give her time.
airdrop is in a more cold war. It's a kind of a different. Right now, we're in the throes of the death throes of a very serious world war. So it's not like Allied planes can just play the Berlin like airdrop game, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm saying? Like it has to be brought in. And, okay.
I get it
We're
I get it to an extent. Like I do. I do understand what you're saying. It's just hard for me in an aspect of where I'm at and what I understand in my
what
own
we understand
brain.
about
Yeah.
today.
Today, yeah, that's what I meant.
Readily available food. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
So we're on the same page. All right.
Yes. Sorry, just took me a bit. Sorry, I'm on the slow train there. My bad.
No,
problem.
you're not, because what you're talking about is outside of our scope today, or outside of our scope maybe even in the late 40s, 50s. We're in still kind of a different time on that drop. We are in the midst of a world war.
Yeah. And it's hard to wrap your brain around something when you're accustomed or you've been exposed to certain aspects of how things are ran. And it's like, wait, why couldn't we do this back then when we had the supplies, we had the available resources, but we couldn't use them because et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
There were enemy planes to stop that. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
it does.
So-
It sucks.
I think
Just
that's a
sucks
good
ass,
point.
okay?
Japan is literally trying to starve them out as well. Like that's a part of the Japanese strategy.
Correct.
So.
Lauren, I can't wait to have you on my future Japanese like war episode. Oh my God, it's going to be so fun. Sorry, sidetrack.
Am I invited? Am I invited to that one or no?
Yes.
Well, yes.
Okay, because I'm not the smartest one between you three, so I'm like trying to follow along as best as I can here. Pick me. I want to learn.
Okay, so let's let Warren finish up because he has to like do shit because he's important.
I am going to have to go. So that was, that is sort of closing it up. I think is just to say my perspective and the research I've seen and in the documents is just to say that Churchill, I think, given the circumstances, did the best that he could, regardless of his private views of Hindus in India. I'm happy to discuss. I went on the radio in Britain to sort of argue this with a sort of Indian journalist
Because he's a big deal.
Because I'm a big deal. And
if you didn't know, Warren's a hashtag big deal, guys.
But I went through and found, the documents to outline all the times that they repeatedly asked the Americans, which is very humiliating for Britain. Hey guys, we can't feed our own population. Can you help?
Hey, please help. Yeah, that sucks.
You know what I
mean, if it wasn't humiliating enough to have to beg for them to enter the war, how much more humiliating must it be to say we have to be able to feed our empire? Like,
because you also have a situation where Churchill's telling Roosevelt at the same time that, hey, the British Empire needs to exist because it's a force for good and it can take care of these people. Hey, by the way, we can't take care of these people. Can you help us?
Oh, damn.
Which, don't let the wheelchair fool you, folks. Old FDR was a tough customer. Let me tell you.
He
And
certainly
that's
was.
a whole nother podcast.
Yay! Add it to the list.
So when we pick this up, I'll talk to you about FDR and Roosevelt negotiating over what the future of the British Empire would be in India, and what the
Because-
conditions were for American help.
Exactly, which I think one is going to be hugely fascinating, and two, I love what exists between the two of them, because I no more agree with some of the decisions that Winston Churchill made, but I know that they were the best that he could do. Whereas sometimes, and I love FDR, I think he's a great American president, don't get me wrong, but I also know that he made decisions also knowing this is the best that we could do. But boy, was he a negotiator. Man should have been a banker.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the guy was an amazing.
He was
he had the
fucking
ability-
ruthless, is
Yeah.
what he was.
That's correct. And he could solve situations by talking to people. I mean, real fascinating. But I agree with you. He also made decisions that were, I don't know, terrifying.
shit.
Japanese Americans in camps. You know what I mean? Like, it's messed up.
It's incredibly messed up. I don't know. If you want to ever be on an episode about Manhattan Project, the ultimate decision to drop the bomb, because I just find that to be a very interesting ethical argument in and of itself.
Well, I'd be happy to, because I teach that, and I know all the literature.
I know you do. I know you're so fucking smart.
I would love to do that. Not that I'm smart, but I am smart, guys. I don't know if you know that.
No,
Okay.
He is
Don't-
very, very smart, guys. I'm not
Don't
gonna
disclaim
lie.
yourselves. Put
He's
yourself
very,
on the
very
pedestal
smart.
higher than Jessica.
No, he deserved it. Unfortunately, he deserves it. Last month, just as a little post entertainment for our viewers, I believe that I yelled at him in text form, "Don't patronize me."
She did. That is true.
True facts.
That is
Well,
a true
because
fact.
I said something that I thought was a little bit controversial and a little bit smart. And he was like, "Oh my God, you're so cute. That's adorable." And you know what? That's how qualified Warren is, guys. I will allow that to happen with
Which is
only
very
a,
rare.
"Don't patronize me."
Be lucky, Warren. Be lucky that's all you got.
No, I know. And I mean, all I was doing was legitimately trying to agree with her. That's all. I was just like, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And she was like, "You fucking son of a bitch. Don't you agree with me?"
Don't you agree with me? You know you shouldn't agree with me. You know that argument is far more nuanced than that. Don't patronize me.
That's exactly the way that went. I was like, yeah,
It's
no,
like
that sounds
she-
great. She was like, "You son of a bitch."
It's like she'll fight you if you agree and fight you if you disagree. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. So take it in stride.
Well, I'll fight you if you disagree because I think I'm right. But if you agree with me, I just automatically assume that it's because you're like, "Oh my God, you're so cute. How
Good for
sweet your
you."
lack of intellect is." And
Hey,
so, bless his
Now you
heart,
know how
he's
it
trying-
fucking feels, Jessica. Now
trying
you
to
know
have a
how it
good
feels.
time. We're trying to do some Churchill prep. And I went crazy and was screaming, "Don't patronize me."
God, maybe I should start learning how to say that and figure out when to say it. Because when you're like, "Yes, you're right, Bethany." Wait, are you patronizing me?
Sometimes,
finally-
yes.
Oh, bitch.
Then it's knives out. Okay,
Damn
guys,
it.
Knives out.
I am gonna have to go. I'm
Because he's a kind of a big deal.
He's got a big deal and he's got to make it to his dinner. And if he doesn't think that I'm going to text annoy him during his dinner, viewers, he is
Ooh, wait.
sadly mistaken.
Why don't
But
I have his number to text him? I'm going to do
I
that.
don't text him. I hit him up on Twitter
Okay.
like a
I'm
normal
gonna do that too.
person.
Oh, I didn't know that was
but
normal.
I'll be giving you both my deets, girls. Don't you worry about
Oh,
that.
give it
Hey.
to you, sex sexy doctor. We want your deets. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Please go check out Churchill and Islam, a lot of other shit that we cannot all of us determine, including the motherfucking author of the book. Please excuse our language. There have been a billion swears. Go and grab it on Amazon, hardback, paperback, Kindle. We thank you all for joining us today, and we will be back at you with part 4 of this interview and the fun resultant body count of everything that is Winston Churchill. Everybody, thank you so much. You have a great week.
Thank you. Love you.
Bye-bye.
Love you guys.
Bye.